I am the granddaughter nobody wanted, the orphan, the reminder of tragedy, the one they'd rather forget. My name is Grace Anderson. I'm 27 years old. I'm a nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. I make $54,000 a year. I live in a small apartment in East Nashville. I drive a 12-year-old Honda Civic. My grandfather was Henry Morrison. He died 3 weeks ago at age 88. He was worth approximately $38 million. Founder of Morrison Construction, one of the largest commercial builders in Tennessee. I barely knew him growing up. Saw him maybe 10 times in my entire childhood. Always at a distance. Always with the understanding that I didn't really belong. Let me explain how I became the forgotten grandchild. My father was Daniel Morrison, Henry's oldest son, successful, married my mother and Anderson when they were both 25. Had me a year later. When I was 8 years old, my parents died in a car accident. Head-on collision with a drunk driver on I-40, both killed instantly. I survived with minor injuries. Miracle, they said. I thought I'd go live with my grandfather, the Morrison family, the mansion in Belle Meade, the money, the security. Instead, I went to live with my maternal grandmother, Anne's mother, Margaret Anderson, a retired teacher living in a modest house in Inglewood. Why? Because Henry Morrison didn't want me. He had 4 other children besides my father Daniel, Patricia, George, Linda, and Frank. My aunts and uncles, they all had their own families, their own children, my cousins, the real Morrisons. I was the orphan, the sad reminder that Daniel was gone. They lost a brother, and looking at me just made it worse. So they sent me away, gave my grandmother Margaret a trust fund $500 a month for my care, paid for my education, but kept me at arm's length. It's better this way, I heard Aunt Patricia tell my grandmother once. Grace needs a stable home, not a grieving family trying to adjust. Translation: we don't want the orphan around. I grew up in Inglewood, working-class neighborhood, good school but nothing fancy. My grandmother did her best, loved me, raised me, but we struggled financially. The $500 a month helped but wasn't enough for anything beyond basics. Meanwhile, my Morrison cousins grew up in Belle Meade mansions, private schools, European vacations, everything money could buy. I saw my grandfather Henry maybe once a year. Christmas, usually. Awkward visits where I'd be the only grandchild who didn't get expensive gifts, who didn't fit in, who reminded everyone of the tragedy. How's school, Grace? Henry would ask. Good, that's nice, end of conversation. Back to talking with the real grandchildren. By the time I was 18, I'd stopped going to Christmas gatherings. Too painful, too obvious I didn't belong. I put myself through nursing school, scholarships, student loans, working 3 jobs, graduated at 23, got hired at Vanderbilt, built a life. I didn't think about the Morrisons much. They were the rich relatives who'd forgotten I existed. Fine, I'd build my own life without them. Then, 5 years ago, everything changed. I was working in the ER when a patient came in, 83 years old, confusion, disorientation, memory loss. His name was Henry Morrison, my grandfather. His daughter Patricia was with him. She recognized me immediately. Grace, you work here. I'm a nurse. What's wrong with Grandpa? He's been confused, forgetting things. We think it might be Alzheimer's. It was early stage but progressing. The doctors recommended memory care within a year or 2. He'll need family support, I told Patricia. Regular visits, familiar faces, routine, of course. We'll make sure he's taken care of. 6 months later, I learned they'd moved Henry into Richland Place, an upscale memory care facility in Brentwood. $12,000 a month, beautiful grounds, excellent care. I only knew because I happened to see it mentioned in a Society page article about prominent businessman Henry Morrison entering retirement care. I debated whether to visit. He'd barely acknowledged me in 19 years. Why would I insert myself now? But something made me go. Curiosity, guilt, Maybe just wanting to see him one more time before the disease took him completely. I drove to Richland Place on a Saturday afternoon, signed in at the desk, asked for Henry Morrison's room. He was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the gardens. He'd aged dramatically, thin, frail, nothing like the powerful businessman I remembered. Grandpa Henry? He turned, looked at me blankly. Do I know you? I'm Grace, Daniel's daughter. Daniel, he frowned. My son. He died. Car accident. Yes, I'm his daughter. Your granddaughter. He studied my face. You look like Anne, Daniel's wife. Beautiful girl. That was my mother. Where is she? She died too. In the same accident. Oh, he looked sad. That's terrible. So young. We talked for an hour. He didn't remember me specifically, didn't remember my childhood, but he remembered my father, talked about him, about the accident, about the grief. When I left, he smiled. Come back soon. I like talking to you. I will, and I did. The next week, and the week after that, every Saturday afternoon, sometimes Sundays too. Most of the time, Henry didn't remember who I was, thought I was a nice nurse, or a volunteer. Once he called me Anne, thought I was my mother, but he always smiled when I arrived, always seemed happy to see me. I brought him things, photos from his construction projects. He'd built half of Nashville's skyline. He'd look at the pictures and tell stories, sometimes the same story 3 times in one visit. I didn't mind. I read to him, newspapers, books about Tennessee history. He loved that. I brought homemade cookies. His favorite was oatmeal raisin. Sometimes we just sat in silence, watching the birds in the garden. I did this for 3 years, every week, sometimes twice a week. Never missed unless I was working a double shift, and even then I'd try to stop by for 15 minutes. And in 3 years, I never saw my aunts or uncles there, never ran into my cousins, never encountered any other Morrisons. I asked the staff once, does Mr. Morrison get many visitors? The nurse checked the log. Family visits maybe once every few months. You're the only regular, 5 children, multiple grandchildren, 1 regular visitor. Me, the forgotten granddaughter. 6 months ago, Henry's condition deteriorated. He stopped recognizing anyone, stopped speaking much, just sat quietly, lost in his own fading mind. I still visited, held his hand, played music he'd loved, talked to him even though he couldn't respond. 3 weeks ago, Richland Place called me at a.m. Miss Anderson, I'm sorry to inform you that Henry Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. I cried, alone in my apartment, for the grandfather I'd barely known but had grown to love over 3 years of visits. I went to the funeral, stood in the back, watched my 5 aunts and uncles in the front row, crying, accepting condolences. He was such a wonderful father, and Patricia told mourners, we'll miss him terribly. I wanted to scream. Where were you for 3 years? Where were you every Saturday when I was reading to him? Where were you when he couldn't remember his own name? But I stayed silent. The forgotten granddaughter in the back row, where I'd always been. After the service, Uncle Frank approached me. Grace, I didn't know you'd be here. He was my grandfather, of course. It's just, we haven't seen you in years. I've been busy. Well, thank you for coming. He walked away, didn't ask about my life, didn't acknowledge that I existed beyond this moment. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from Patterson and Associates, attorneys at law. You are requested to attend the reading of Henry Morrison's last will and testament. Monday, November 20th, 2:00 p.m. Morrison Construction Headquarters, Conference Room A. I stared at the letter. Why was I invited? Henry had barely known I existed for most of my life. Maybe he'd left me something small. $5,000. $10,000. A token thank you for existing. I almost didn't go, but something made me RSVP. Curiosity, closure, or maybe just wanting to see my family one more time before disappearing from their lives forever. Monday afternoon, I arrived at Morrison Construction Headquarters, a gleaming office building in downtown Nashville. built by my grandfather 40 years ago. I'd never been inside, never been invited. The receptionist directed me to conference room A, third floor, corner office with views of the Cumberland River. I walked in. The room was already full. My 5 aunts and uncles. Uncle Daniel's widow had remarried, and wasn't there just his siblings? Patricia, George, Linda, Frank, all in expensive suits, looking like money. Their children my cousins. I counted 8 of them, all adults now, all successful looking, lawyers, doctors, business owners, the Morrison grandchildren, and me, in my Target dress, my hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, my nurse's sensible shoes. Everyone turned to look at me when I entered. Aunt Patricia stood. Grace, what are you doing here? I was invited. Got a letter from the attorney. That's unexpected. This is for family. I am family. Henry was my grandfather. Awkward silence. Uncle George spoke up. Of course, you're Daniel's daughter. You have every right to be here. Please sit. There was one empty chair, in the back corner, away from the table where the real family sat. I sat down, alone, separate, the forgotten grandchild in her designated spot. I could hear whispers, my cousins talking. Who is that? Daniel's daughter, the one who was raised by her other grandmother. Why is she here? Probably getting some token amount. Grandpa Henry barely knew her. The door opened. A man in his 60s walked in, distinguished, carrying a briefcase. Good afternoon. I'm Robert Hayes. I've been Henry Morrison's attorney for 35 years. Thank you all for coming. I know this is difficult. He sat at the head of the conference table, opened his briefcase, pulled out documents. Before we begin the formal reading, Henry asked me to share something. He was very specific about this. He wanted it said before anyone learned what they were receiving. Robert looked around the room, at Patricia, George, Linda, Frank, the 8 cousins, me in the back corner. Henry Morrison spent the last 3 years of his life at Richland Place Memory Care. During that time, he kept meticulous records, or rather, the facility did. Visitor logs, documentation of every interaction, every visit, every call. He pulled out a paper. Henry asked me to read these numbers out loud. To all of you, before anyone learns their inheritance. The room went tense. Nobody spoke. Robert began reading. Patricia Morrison. In the last 3 years from the time Henry entered Richland Place until his death, you visited your father 6 times, twice a year, usually on his birthday and Christmas. Aunt Patricia's face went red. George Morrison. You visited 5 times in 3 years. Uncle George stared at the table. Linda Morrison. 4 visits in 3 years. Aunt Linda shifted uncomfortably. Frank Morrison. 3 visits in 3 years. Uncle Frank crossed his arms defensively. Total visits from Henry's 4 surviving children over 3 years, 18 visits, average of 1.5 visits per child per year, or 1 visit every 8 months. The cousins were looking at each other, uncomfortable. The 8 grandchildren present in this room. Combined total visits over 3 years, 0. None of you visited Henry Morrison at Richland Place. One cousin started to protest. We were busy, let me finish, Robert said firmly. There was one person who visited regularly, consistently, without fail. He looked directly at me. Grace Anderson, granddaughter through Daniel Morrison, who died 23 years ago. Grace visited her grandfather 142 times over the past 3 years. Silence. Complete silence. That's an average of 47 visits per year. Almost once a week, sometimes twice a week. She visited on holidays, on her birthday, on his birthday, on random Tuesdays when she had an hour free. She brought him cookies, read to him, sat with him even when he couldn't remember her name. Tears were streaming down my face. I hadn't realized anyone was keeping track. Henry Morrison had Alzheimer's, Robert continued. He didn't always remember Grace. Sometimes he thought she was a nurse. Sometimes he thought she was her mother Anne. Sometimes he didn't know who she was at all. He paused, looked at my aunts and uncles. But she came anyway, every single week. while his own children visited 18 times in 3 years. While his grandchildren visited 0 times, Aunt Patricia spoke up. We were busy. We have careers, families. Grace is a nurse. She works 12-hour shifts at Vanderbilt. She makes $54,000 a year. She has student loans. She lives in a small apartment. She found time. This isn't fair, Uncle George started. Henry thought it was very fair. In fact, he said, and I quote from a letter he wrote 2 years ago when he was still lucid enough to write, "My children abandoned me. They put me in expensive care and forgot I existed. But Grace, the granddaughter I barely knew, the orphan I pushed away, she came back. She gave me her time, her love. She asked for nothing. She deserves everything." Robert opened the will, looked around the room. I'm going to read Henry Morrison's last will and testament now. I wanted you all to understand the context first, to know why Henry made the decisions he made. He began reading, and I watched my family's faces change as they realized what those 142 visits had earned me. Robert cleared his throat and began reading. I, Henry Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this my last will and testament, executed 2 years ago and superseding all prior wills, 2 years ago, when he still had moments of lucidity, when he could still make decisions. To my daughter, Patricia Morrison, I leave $3 million in cash and securities, and Patricia nodded. $3 million, solid inheritance. To my son, George Morrison, I leave $3 million in cash and securities. Uncle George smiled slightly. Same amount. Fair. To my daughter, Linda Morrison, I leave $3 million in cash and securities, and Linda looked satisfied. To my son, Frank Morrison, I leave $3 million in cash and securities. Uncle Frank relaxed. $3 million each. $15 million total to the 4 children. Generous. To my 8 grandchildren excluding Grace Anderson, who is addressed separately, I leave a combined total of $800,000 to be divided equally. $100,000 each. The cousins looked disappointed but not shocked. $100,000 each was something. Total distributed to my 4 children and 8 grandchildren. $15.8 million. Robert paused, looked up. That leaves approximately $22 million in remaining assets, primarily Morrison Construction and related properties. Everyone sat forward. Who was getting the company? Before I continue, I need to read something. A letter Henry wrote to be read at this exact moment. He pulled out an envelope, started reading in my grandfather's voice. To my children and grandchildren, I'm writing this while I still can, while I still remember who you are, while I still understand what I'm doing. I've been at Richland Place for 6 months now. The Alzheimer's is getting worse. Some days I don't know where I am, who I am, but I know this. I'm alone. You put me here, said it was the best care, the best facility. You paid for everything $12,000 a month. You made sure I had the best room, the best doctors, the best everything, except the best thing, which is family, which is presence, which is someone who gives a damn. In 6 months, Patricia has visited me 3 times, George twice, Linda once, Frank once. My grandchildren? 0. You're busy. I understand. Lives to live, careers, families of your own. But here's something you don't know. Someone has been visiting me every single week. Someone I barely knew. Someone I pushed away 20 years ago. Someone I failed completely as a grandfather. Grace, Daniel's daughter, the granddaughter I ignored. The orphan I sent to live with her other grandmother because I couldn't bear to look at her and remember I'd lost my son. Grace comes every Saturday, brings me cookies, reads the newspaper to me, shows me photos of buildings I designed, tells me stories. Half the time, I don't know who she is. I call her Anne, or think she's a nurse, or forget entirely why she's there. But she keeps coming, never asks for anything, never expects recognition, just comes. Today I asked the nurse, "How often does my family visit?" She showed me the log. 7 visits in 6 months from my 4 children. 0 from my grandchildren, 31 from Grace. That's when I called Robert, updated my will, made this decision. Grace deserves everything you don't. With clarity and purpose, Henry Morrison Roberts set down the letter. The room was silent. Then he continued reading the will. To Grace Anderson, my granddaughter through my late son Daniel, I leave the following. I couldn't breathe. My home in Belle Meade, valued at approximately $6 million, the house, the mansion, the place I'd never been welcome, my art collection and personal effects, valued at approximately $2 million, gasps from my cousins, and 100% ownership of Morrison Construction and all subsidiary companies, valued at approximately $22 million, including controlling interest, voting rights, and full operational authority. The room exploded. WHAT, and Patricia stood up. The company? She gets the entire company? She doesn't know anything about construction, Uncle George shouted. She's a nurse. Uncle Frank's face was purple. Robert waited for the noise to die down. Grace Anderson is now the sole owner of Morrison Construction. Your grandfather's final wish. This is insane. Aunt Linda was crying. Dad built that company for us, for the Morrison family. Grace is the Morrison family, Robert said calmly. She's Daniel's daughter, Henry's granddaughter, and the only one who treated him like family in his final years. We paid for his care, Aunt Patricia screamed. $12,000 a month. We made sure he had everything except yourselves, Robert interrupted. You paid for care. Grace provided love. Henry knew the difference. One of my cousins spoke up. She manipulated him. While he had Alzheimer's, she convinced a confused old man this will was executed 2 years ago, Robert said firmly, when Henry was still lucid enough to pass competency tests. We have medical documentation. 3 independent witnesses. It's ironclad. We're contesting, Uncle George said. All of us. Today, there's an interim clause, Robert said. If you contest and lose, you forfeit your inheritance completely. Your $3 million becomes 0. It's worth the risk, Aunt Patricia said. She can't just waltz in here after barely knowing him. She visited 142 times in 3 years. Robert's voice rose. You visited 18 times combined. She was there every single week while you were. Where? Too busy? Too important? She's a child, Uncle Frank said. She's 27 years old. Old enough to show up. Old enough to care. Old enough to inherit. Aunt Patricia turned to me. Her face twisted with rage. You did this. You found out he was sick, vulnerable. You swooped in, played the poor little orphan, manipulated him. I didn't know he'd left me anything, I said quietly, my voice shaking. I visited because he was alone, because nobody else did, because he was my grandfather and I loved him even though he barely knew I existed. Liar, I'm not lying. I had no idea about the will until 5 minutes ago. Uncle George stood. We're getting attorneys, real attorneys. We're fighting this. Grace, you're not going to get away with this. Feel free to contest, Robert said. But you'll lose, and you'll lose your $3 million. Is that worth it? The uncles and aunts looked at each other, calculating. $3 million guaranteed versus 0 if they lost. We'll sue for undue influence, and Linda said. For elder abuse, for manipulation. Henry anticipated that, Robert said. That's why he left you each $3 million. So you'd have something to lose. So you'd think twice before destroying your inheritance out of spite. He looked at me. Grace, you now own Morrison Construction. 100%. What you do with it is entirely your decision. I looked at my aunts and uncles, at my cousins, at the family that had forgotten I existed. I want to do right by Grandpa Henry, I said. I want to honor what he built. I'm not here to destroy anything. You've already destroyed everything. Aunt Patricia grabbed her purse. Come on, we're leaving. We're finding lawyers. We're fighting this. They stormed out. All of them. The 4 aunts and uncles. The 8 cousins. Leaving me alone in the conference room with Robert. I sat there, shaking. Did that really just happen? Yes. You now own a $22 million construction company, plus a $6 million house, plus $2 million in personal property. You're worth approximately $30 million. I'm a nurse. I don't know anything about construction. You'll learn. Morrison Construction has excellent management, a great team. They can help you transition. Why did he do this? Really? Robert smiled gently. Because you were there when nobody else was. Because 142 visits over 3 years meant more to him than $12,000 a month in fancy care ever could. He handed me a final envelope. This is for you, personally, from Henry. He asked me to give it to you after the will was read. I opened it. A letter, in shaky handwriting. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, you now own everything, and you're probably confused, possibly terrified, maybe wondering why. Here's why. You came back. I was a terrible grandfather to you. When your father died, I pushed you away. Couldn't bear to look at you without remembering what I'd lost. Sent you to live with your other grandmother. Gave you money but never love. You had every reason to hate me, to never speak to me again. But when you found out I was sick, you came. Every week, even when I didn't recognize you, even when I called you by your mother's name, even when I forgot you entirely. You gave me something my own children never did. Your time, your presence, your love. I'm leaving you everything because you're the only one who deserves it, the only one who saw me as a person, not just a bank account. My children will be furious. They'll contest. They'll call you a manipulator. Don't listen. You earned this. Every dollar, every brick of every building Morrison Construction ever built. It's yours. Run the company. Sell it. Change it. It's your decision now. I'm sorry I wasn't a better grandfather when you needed one. I hope this makes up for some of that. With love and regret, Grandpa Henry, I cried, alone in that conference room, for the grandfather I'd found too late, for the family I'd never really had, for the weight of what I'd just inherited. My father's lawyer had looked around the room and said only one of you visited him last year. Actually, it was 142 of me over 3 years versus 18 of them, and that made all the difference. The lawsuits came within a week, all for aunts and uncles hired attorneys, filed motions contesting the will, claiming undue influence, mental incompetence, elder abuse. Grace Anderson manipulated a vulnerable elderly man with dementia, their petition read. She isolated him from his family, created a dependent relationship, and convinced him to disinherit his own children. It hurt, reading those words, but Robert assured me we'd win. They visited 18 times in 3 years. You visited 142 times. The visitor logs don't lie. The nursing staff will testify you never asked Henry for anything, never discussed his will, never manipulated him. The case went to probate court. 6 months of depositions, discovery, testimony. My aunts and uncles painted me as a gold digger, a manipulative nurse who targeted a wealthy patient. She had access to him, their attorney argued. She knew he had Alzheimer's. She exploited his vulnerability, but then the Richland Place staff testified. Grace never asked about Mr. Morrison's finances, the head nurse said. She came to visit, brought cookies, read to him. That's all. She didn't even know how wealthy he was until after he died. The medical expert confirmed Henry had been competent when he executed the will 2 years prior. He understood what he was doing, who his beneficiaries were, what he was leaving them. The visitor logs were entered into evidence. 142 visits by Grace versus 18 by the 4 children combined. You visited your father an average of once every 2 months, the judge said to Aunt Patricia. Grace visited once a week, sometimes twice. We were busy, so was Grace. She worked 12-hour nursing shifts. She still found time. After 4 months of testimony, the judge ruled, the will is valid, properly executed. Henry Morrison was competent. There's no evidence of undue influence. The beneficiaries are determined as stated in the will. My aunts and uncles lost, and because they'd contested, the interim clause kicked in. They forfeited their $3 million each. They walked away with nothing. Zero. While I inherited everything. Aunt Patricia tried one last appeal. It failed. You destroyed our family, she told me outside the courthouse. No, I said quietly. You destroyed yourselves. You abandoned your father, then blamed me for being there. They never spoke to me again. Morrison Construction had been running itself for years. Henry had built a strong management team, CEO, CFO, operations director. They knew what they were doing. We can continue operating without major changes, the CEO, Marcus Williams, told me. You're the owner, but you don't need to be involved day to day unless you want to. I want to learn. I want to understand what Grandpa built. Over the next year, I learned the construction business, attended meetings, reviewed contracts, visited job sites. I kept my nursing job for 6 months. Couldn't let go entirely, but eventually, running a $22 million company required my full attention. I made changes, added a charitable division building affordable housing, partnering with Habitat for Humanity, using Morrison's expertise to help families in need. Your grandfather would have loved this, Marcus said. He always wanted to give back. Never quite got around to it. Revenue grew. The company expanded. We built schools, community centers, mixed income housing developments. The Nashville Business Journal ran a feature. Orphan nurse inherits construction empire, transforms it for good. I donated generously to nursing scholarships, to memory care facilities, to orphanages. Money I never expected, wealth I'd never dreamed of, used to help people like me, people who'd been forgotten, overlooked, left behind. The Belmead mansion sat empty for a year. I couldn't bring myself to live there. Too many memories, too much pain. Finally, I decided I'd turn it into something meaningful. The Grace and Henry Morrison House became a respite care facility for family caregivers. People caring for loved ones with Alzheimer's could stay there for free, rest, recharge, be supported. When I was visiting Grandpa, I was exhausted, I told the board, emotionally drained. I needed a place to decompress, to talk to others who understood. This house can be that place. We opened with space for 12 families at a time, offered counseling, support groups, respite care. One woman told me, I've been caring for my husband with dementia for years. I was ready to break. This house saved me. That's what Grandpa Henry's mansion became. Not a monument to wealth, a refuge for the exhausted and forgotten. 5 years after Henry died, I found another letter, hidden in his desk drawer in the study, addressed to me, dated 3 months before his death. My dear Grace, I probably won't remember writing this by the time you find it. The Alzheimer's is taking more each day. Yesterday I didn't remember Linda's name, my own daughter. But today, right now, I remember you. I remember your visits. I remember that you're the only one who comes. I've been thinking about Daniel, your father, my oldest son. I wasn't there for him enough when he was alive. Too busy building the company, making money, proving something. Then he died. And I couldn't face you because you reminded me of my failure, my absence, my priorities. I sent you away, gave you money but no love, no family, no belonging. You grew up without me, without the Morrison family. You built your life alone. And then, when I needed someone, when I was scared and confused and didn't know where I was, you came back. You didn't have to. I'd given you nothing, but you came anyway. That's the kind of person you are, the kind of person I should have been. I'm leaving you everything because it's what you deserve, but more than that because I want you to have what I never gave you when you needed it most. A home, security, the knowledge that you matter, that you're valued, that you're not forgotten. You were always a Morrison, Grace. I just failed to see it. I see it now, finally. Too late, but I see it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Thank you for being the granddaughter I didn't deserve but somehow got anyway. With love, Grandpa, I cried. 5 years later and he could still reach me. 10 years after Henry died, Morrison Construction was worth $65 million. We'd built over 50 affordable housing projects, employed 800 people, changed Nashville's landscape. The respite house had helped 3,000 families, caregivers who were drowning, who needed rest, who needed to know they weren't alone. I was 37, successful, wealthy, content. I gave a keynote speech at a healthcare conference. When showing up is everything, 10 years ago, my grandfather died. At his will reading, the lawyer looked around the room and said, "Only one of you visited him last year. Actually, only one of us visited him at all. Me, 142 times in 3 years, while his 4 children visited 18 times combined." Why did I visit? Not because I expected anything. I'd been the forgotten granddaughter my entire life. I visited because he was alone, because nobody else did, because showing up is what family does. My grandfather left me everything: 30 million, a construction company, a mansion, not because I asked for it, because I was there. That's the lesson. Showing up matters. Being present matters. Loving people even when they don't remember you matters. Don't show up because of what you might get. Show up because it's right, because someone is alone, because presence is the greatest gift we can give. Standing ovation. 15 years after Henry died, I received an email from Aunt Patricia. "Grace, I'm writing to apologize for everything, for how we treated you, for contesting the will, for the lawsuits, for not seeing what you gave my father. I've spent 15 years angry, bitter, blaming you, but I'm 73 now. I don't have much time left. I don't want to die with this hatred. Can we talk?" We met at a coffee shop in Green Hills. Patricia looked old, tired, defeated. "I was wrong," she said. "About you, about Dad, about everything. You gave him what we did in time. Love, presence. He deserved to leave you everything. You earned it. Thank you for saying that. Can you forgive me?" I thought about it. 15 years of distance, of lawsuits, of accusations, of pain. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because you deserve it, because I need to let it go. I don't deserve it." "I know, but thank you. We didn't become close. Too much damage, but we made peace." She died 2 years later, left me a letter apologizing again, left me nothing in her will because she had nothing left to leave. 20 years after Henry died, I was 47. Morrison Construction was worth $120 million. The respite house had helped 10,000 families. I'd married, had 2 children, given them the stable family I'd never had. My daughter asked me once, "Mommy, why do you work so hard helping people?" "Because I know what it's like to be forgotten, to be the one nobody wants. I don't want anyone else to feel that way." I took her to visit the respite house, showed her the families, the exhausted caregivers, the people finding hope. "Your great-grandfather built buildings. I'm trying to build something different. Community, belonging, a place where nobody is forgotten, like you were." Yes, like I was. That night, I thought about that while reading 20 years ago. The lawyer looking around the room, the shock on my aunts' and uncles' faces, the moment everything changed. "Only one of you visited him last year. Actually, 142 times over 3 years. Not because I expected anything, because showing up was right. I built an empire from those visits, not of money, of purpose." The forgotten granddaughter became the honored heiress. The orphan nobody wanted became the owner of everything, all because I showed up when nobody else did. 20 years later, I understood what Grandpa Henry had really given me. Not wealth, recognition, the knowledge that I mattered, that my presence had value, that the forgotten granddaughter was worth more than anyone knew. My father's lawyer looked around the room and said, "Only one of you visited him last year, and that one person changed everything, not just for me, for thousands of families, thousands of people who needed to know they weren't alone." That was the real inheritance, not the millions, the knowledge that showing up matters, always,